rain mixed with blood in the gutter. Vincent didn't stop for dead bodies. It was bad for business. But the silver badge glinting under the broken streetlight made him pause. It belonged to the precinct's toughest detective, and she was bleeding out on his turf. Saving a cop was a death sentence in his world. Leaving her meant letting a rat in the police force win. What he did next didn't just break the rules. It ripped the entire city apart. The rain in November didn't wash the city clean. It just made the grime slick. Vincent Rossi stood under the awning of a shuttered laundromat, lighting a cigarette. The match flared, casting sharp shadows across his face. He was 42, though the grey salting his dark hair and the heavy lines around his eyes suggested a decade more. He exhaled, watching the smoke tangle with the freezing drizzle. "Cars out back, boss," Leo said, stepping up beside him. Leo was built like a cinder block, loyal to a fault, and currently freezing in a leather jacket that wasn't meant for a downpour. Vincent didn't move immediately. He listened to the city. Sirens wailed in the distance, a constant, meaningless soundtrack to their lives. He flicked the match into a puddle. "Let's go." They walked down the narrow alley connecting 4th Street to the service road. The smell of rotting garbage and wet brick was overpowering. Halfway down the block, Vincent stopped. A pile of trash bags had collapsed near a rusted dumpster, but the shape wasn't right. The silhouette was too jagged, too human. "Keep walking, Vince," Leo muttered, his hand instinctively resting on the bulge beneath his jacket. "Not our problem." Vincent took a step closer. A low, wet rasp broke the rhythm of the Rhine. Someone was breathing, but barely. He stepped around a discarded tire and looked down. A woman lay crumpled on her side, her knees pulled tight to her chest. Her dark trench coat was soaked, heavily stained with something darker and thicker than rainwater. Her blonde hair, plastered to her skull, hid most of her face. But it was the object inches from her slack hand that caught his attention. A gold shield. Police. Vincent crouched. He didn't care about cops. Cops were either on his payroll or in his way. But the unwritten rule of the streets was simple. You don't drop a badge on Rossi turf unless you want the entire department tearing apart your operations by sunrise. He reached out, his leather-gloved hand brushing the wet hair from her face. He recognized her instantly. Detective Sarah Jenkins. 3 months ago, she had kicked down the door of his Southside distribution center. She hadn't taken a bribe. She hadn't flinched when his men surrounded her. She just stood there, icy blue eyes locked on his, and handed him a warrant. She was a pain in his arse, an anomaly in a city that ran on dirty money. Right now, she was dying. "Boss," Leo said, his voice dropping an octave. "That's Jenkins. Leave her. She catches her last breath here. The cops tear this block apart. We need to be gone." Vincent ignored him. He pressed 2 fingers to the side of her neck. Her pulse was a frantic, fluttery thing, like a trapped bird beating against a window. He shifted his gaze to her torso. The coat was torn, 2 entry wounds, gut and lower chest. It was sloppy work, a hit meant to make her suffer. "Who did this?" Vincent asked the empty alley. Jenkins groaned. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing a sliver of clouded, unfocused blue. Her lips parted, pale and trembling. She tried to speak, but only a thick bubble of blood spilled over her bottom lip. Vincent watched her. If she died, the heat came down on his crew. The mayor would demand a crackdown, his shipments would stall. The pragmatic move was to walk away, call an anonymous tip from a burner phone, and let the paramedics find a corpse. But as he looked at her, Jenkins's hand twitched. Her fingers, stained red, blindly grasped the lapel of Vincent's expensive wool overcoat. Her grip was startlingly strong for a woman with half her blood volume in the gutter. She wasn't begging. She was pulling herself up. Even bleeding out in an alley, she was trying to fight. Vincent stared at her knuckles, white with effort, and felt a strange, cold shift in his chest. A profound irritation mixed with reluctant respect. "Get the car," Vincent ordered. "Vince, are you out of your mind?" Leo hissed, taking a step back. "You put a bleeding cop in your trunk, we both go away for life." "I didn't say put her in the trunk. Put her in the back seat, now." Leo swore under his breath, turning on his heel and sprinting toward the service road. Vincent looked back down at the detective. Her grip on his coat loosened, her arm dropping to the wet asphalt with a dull thud. She was out cold. Vincent slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back. He lifted her. She was surprisingly light, her body limp and fragile. The warm metallic scent of fresh blood immediately soaked into his clothes, ruining a $2,000 suit. He didn't care. As he carried her out of the alley, toward the idling black sedan, his mind was already calculating. Someone had ordered a hit on the only clean cop in the district. Vincent was going to find out who, and then he was going to make them pay for leaving their garbage on his doorstep. The interior of the sedan was silent, except for the frantic hum of the heater and the ragged, bubbling sound of Sarah Jenkins fighting for air. Vincent sat in the back with her, pressing a thick towel against her stomach. The towel had turned black with blood 10 minutes ago. "Faster, Leo," Vincent said, his voice flat. "I'm pushing 80, boss. The roads are glass." Leo's eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, wide and panicked. Vincent applied more pressure. Jenkins let out a sharp, unconscious cry, her body arching off the leather seat. He held her down firmly. "Stay still," he muttered, though he knew she couldn't hear him. They tore down a dilapidated industrial strip and skidded into an underground parking garage. The tires screeched against the concrete before Leo slammed the car into park. Vincent kicked his door open. "Get the door!" Vincent barked, pulling Jenkins out of the car. Leo ran ahead, pounding his fist against a heavy steel door labeled storage. A camera above the frame whirred, focusing on them. A second later, the locks clacked and the door swung open. Dr. Thomas Holden stood in the doorway, tying a stained surgical apron around his waist. He looked like what he was, a brilliant surgeon who had lost his license to a gambling addiction and now stitched up mobsters to pay off his debts. Holden looked at Vincent, then down at the bleeding woman in his arms. His eyes widened, catching the glint of the badge dangling from her belt. "Absolutely not," Holden said, taking a step back. "No way, Vincent. I patch up your boys. I don't touch cops." "Move, Tommy," Vincent warned, stepping into the clinic. It was a sterile, brightly lit basement room that smelled sharply of bleach and cheap rubbing alcohol. "Do you know what happens if she dies on my table? They'll execute me. The union will string me up from a bridge." Holden was backing away toward the stainless steel examination table. Vincent laid Jenkins down on the cold metal. "If you don't fix her right now, you won't live long enough to worry about the union." Holden swallowed hard, looking at Vincent's dead, expressionless eyes. He grabbed a pair of shears and moved to the table. "Hold her down. This isn't going to be pretty." For the next hour, Vincent stood in the corner of the room, his blood-soaked coat discarded on a chair. He watched in silence as Holden worked. The surgeon was fast, his hands steadying the moment they touched a scalpel. He cut away Jenkins's ruined clothing, suctioned the blood, and dug into her flesh to find the damage. The heart monitor beeped in a rapid, unsteady rhythm. It was the only sound in the room, save for the wet snip of surgical tools and Holden's heavy breathing. "Got one," Holden grunted. He reached in with forceps. A metallic clink echoed through the room as he dropped a deformed piece of lead into a steel kidney tray. Missed the liver by an inch. Tore through the bowel. Vincent stepped forward, picking up the tray. He stared at the bloody lump of metal. He was a man who knew firearms intimately. He didn't need a ballistics lab to recognize the shape and weight. It was a 9mm hollow point. "Get the second one," Vincent said softly. Holden worked for another 20 minutes before dropping the second bullet into the tray. It was identical. Vincent stared at the two bullets, rolling them around in the metal pan. These weren't gangbanger bullets. They weren't cheap, imported rounds sold out of trunks. These were high-grade, standard-issue police ammunition. Jenkins hadn't been ambushed by a cartel or a street crew. She had been shot by her own people. "She gonna make it?" Vincent asked, setting the tray down. "I stopped the bleeding," Holden said, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm. "Sewed up her gut, but she lost a lot of blood. If she doesn't catch an infection, she's got a 50-50 shot. She needs a real hospital, Vince. She stays here. You don't leave this room." Holden opened his mouth to argue, but the heart monitor's pitch shifted. The rhythm leveled out. On the table, Sarah Jenkins groaned. Vincent walked over to the table. He stood directly in her line of sight. Her eyelashes fluttered. It took a long time for her eyes to open, and when they did, they were glassy with painkillers and blood loss. She stared at the harsh fluorescent lights above her. Then, slowly, she turned her head. Her gaze locked onto Vincent. It took a few seconds for her brain to connect the face to the files she had memorized. When she did, her pupils dilated. Her breathing hitched. Her hand instantly twitched toward her right hip, searching for a holster that wasn't there. "It's gone," Vincent said, his voice a low, calm rumble. Sarah swallowed, her throat dry. She tried to sit up, but the pain hit her like a sledgehammer. She gasped, falling back against the metal table, her face twisting in agony. "Where?" Her voice was broken glass. She squeezed her eyes shut. "Where am I?" "Somewhere safe," Vincent replied. She opened her eyes, glaring at him with a mixture of terror and raw defiance. "Vincent Rossi, if you're going to kill me, just do it." Vincent leaned forward, resting his hands on the edge of the surgical table. He looked down at the woman who had spent the last year trying to put him in a cage. "Kill you?" Vincent said, a dark, cynical smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Detective, I just spent 50 grand on your surgery, and judging by the police-issue bullets Doc just pulled out of your stomach, I'm the only friend you have left in this city." Sarah stared at him, the reality of his words slowly cutting through the haze of drug. The fight drained out of her, leaving only cold, terrifying clarity. She was completely at the mercy of the city's worst criminal. And worse, he was right. Captain Thomas Hayes stood by the window of his third-floor office, watching the morning traffic crawl through the sleet. The radiator beneath the sill hissed, pumping dry, stale heat into a room that smelled distinctly of cheap cigars and nervous sweat. Hayes rubbed a hand over his jaw. The stubble felt like sandpaper. He hadn't slept. The door opened without a knock. Detective Paul Gallagher walked in, dropping a sodden manila folder onto the center of Hayes's desk. Gallagher was a broad-shouldered man with a face that looked like it had been broken and reset in a dark room. "Well?" Hayes asked, turning away from the window. Gallagher shook his head. "We scoured the whole block. Found the blood pool behind the laundromat on 4th. Lab confirmed it 10 minutes ago. It's O negative. It's Jenkins." And the body? Gone. Gallagher crossed his arms, the leather of his jacket squeaking in the quiet office. No drag marks past the alley opening, no shell casings. Somebody picked her up and drove off. Hayes felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The plan had been simple. Jenkins was getting too close to the harbour payroll. She had spent the last 2 weeks pulling requisition forms and comparing them against the impound lot ledgers. She was going to figure out that the narcotics division was moving more product than the cartels. Gallagher was supposed to put 2 hollow points in her chest, strip her badge, and leave her in a rival gang's territory to start a street war. Instead, they had a massive bloodstain and a missing detective. "Who takes a dead cop, Paul?" Hayes kept his voice low, a dangerous rasp. "A junkie? A street crew? They'd strip her wallet and run. They wouldn't load a bleeding body into a car." "Maybe she wasn't dead," Gallagher offered, though he didn't sound convinced. "I hit her center mass, twice, but she went down behind a dumpster. I didn't have time to check the pulse. Sirens started wailing 2 blocks over. If she's alive, she's in a hospital. Have you checked the ERs?" "Every single one in a 50-mile radius. Nobody matching her description was admitted. Nobody called in a gunshot wound." Gallagher leaned over the desk. "She bled out, Captain. Nobody survives that much blood loss in freezing rain. Whoever took her is just figuring out how to dump the body." Hayes stared at the folder. He needed Jenkins dead, but more importantly, he needed a body to parade in front of the press. He needed to point the finger at Vincent Rossi's crew to justify the upcoming raids. Without a body, they had nothing but a missing persons case. "Double the patrols in Rossi's territory," Hayes ordered, sitting heavily in his chair. "Tear up his bars, raid his holding companies, shake his people until somebody drops her location. I want her found by midnight. Across the city, far beneath the neon signs of a strip mall, Sarah Jenkins woke to the smell of iodine and stale coffee. She didn't open her eyes immediately. She took an inventory of her body. Her head throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. Her mouth tasted like old copper. But the worst was her abdomen. It felt as though someone had packed her stomach with crushed glass and set it on fire. She took a shallow breath. The pain spiked, sharp and breathless, forcing a low gasp from her lips. "Don't try to sit up, you'll tear the sutures." The voice was deep, smooth, and entirely calm. Sarah forced her eyes open. The harsh fluorescent lights blinded her for a moment. As her vision adjusted, she saw Vincent Rossi sitting in a folding steel chair a few feet from the examination table. He was reading a newspaper, a styrofoam cup of coffee resting on his knee. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal a faded scar running down his left forearm. He looked entirely out of place in the dingy, subterranean clinic. Sarah's hand instinctively drifted toward her hip again. "Still not there," Vincent murmured, not looking up from his paper. "Though I admire the muscle memory." "How long have I been out?" Sarah's voice cracked. She sounded like she had swallowed sand. 14 hours. Vincent folded the newspaper with slow, deliberate movements. He set it on a nearby tray and looked at her. His dark eyes were unreadable. "You spiked a fever around 3 in the morning. Doc pumped you full of broad-spectrum antibiotics. Said you have the constitution of a stubborn mule. I think he meant it as a compliment." Sarah stared at the ceiling, piecing the fragments of the previous night together. The alley, the freezing rain, the sudden deafening crack of gunfire, the burning impact that threw her to the pavement. She remembered looking up and seeing a shadow stepping out from the fire escape. She remembered the shape of the man holding the gun. Broad shoulders, heavy boots, Gallagher. A wave of nausea washed over her, entirely unrelated to her physical wounds. It was Gallagher, a man she had shared coffee with, a man who had covered her 6 during a raid just last month. Her own department had tried to put her in the ground. "Your heart rate is climbing," Vincent observed mildly, glancing at the monitor beside her bed. "Panic isn't going to help you heal." "I'm not panicking," Sarah whispered, though her chest heaved. She turned her head to look at the mob boss. "Why am I alive, Rossi? You could have left me. You should have left me." "I considered it," Vincent admitted, his tone conversational. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "A dead cop on my territory brings heat. A live cop brings a different kind of heat. But I don't like messes I didn't authorize. And I really don't like someone using my backyard as a dumping ground for their dirty laundry." He stood up, walking over to the metal counter. He picked up a small plastic specimen bag and tossed it onto Sarah's chest. She flinched as the plastic landed on her collarbone. She looked down. Inside the bag were 2 deformed bullets. "Federal Hydroshock, 9mm, Vincent said, his voice dropping an octave, losing the conversational edge. "Standard issue for the city's Violent Crimes Division. Your friends do messy work, Detective." Sarah closed her eyes, the tears she refused to shed, burning behind her eyelids. The proof was right there, resting heavy against her skin. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice hollow. "Now," Vincent said, walking back to the door, "you rest, because when you can stand, you're going to tell me exactly what you were looking into that made your captain decide you needed a closed-casket funeral." The clinic felt more like a tomb as the hours dragged on. Sarah slept fitfully, her dreams a violent montage of muzzle flashes and rayon. Every time she woke, the pain in her gut anchored her back to reality. Dr. Holden checked on her twice. He was a nervous man, smelling heavily of nicotine and regret. He didn't speak to her, merely checked her bandages, adjusted her IV, and avoided her eyes entirely. She knew who he was. Thomas Holden. He had disappeared from the medical board's radar 3 years ago after a malpractice suit tied to a severe gambling problem. Finding him down here, stitching up gunshot wounds for the Mafia, answered a lot of unsolved questions sitting in cold case files. But Sarah didn't have the luxury of arresting him. She couldn't even sit up without her vision tunneling. On the 3rd day, the steel door opened and Vincent walked in. He carried a heavy black leather briefcase. He pulled up the same steel chair, sat down, and clicked the briefcase open on his lap. Sarah watched him, her breathing shallow but steady. The fever had broken. Her mind was sharp again, even if her body felt like a ruined shell. "Your precinct is busy," Vincent said, pulling a stack of photographs from the briefcase. "They raided 2 of my waterfront warehouses last night, kicked down the doors of a legitimate import business I own in the Diamond District this morning. They're looking for you. Or rather, they are looking for a reason to blame me for your disappearance. They need a scapegoat," Sarah said, her voice raspy. "If I vanished in your territory, it gives Hayes the leverage he needs to get federal warrants on your holdings." Hayes. Vincent tested the name on his tongue. He laid a photograph on the edge of her bed. It was a surveillance still, grainy and dark. It showed Captain Hayes standing by the docks, talking to a man Vincent recognized as a mid-level enforcer for the Reyes cartel. Sarah stared at the photo. Her heart gave a heavy, painful thump against her ribs. "I have men who watch the docks. I protect my interests," Vincent explained smoothly. "I thought Hayes was just a greedy cop taking a cut to look the other way. But this photo was taken 2 nights ago. He's not looking the other way. He's actively facilitating the Reyes shipments." "I was auditing the impound ledgers," Sarah murmured, the pieces finally snapping together in her mind. "A month ago, we busted a massive heroin shipment. Reyes product. It was logged into evidence. But when I ran the weight discrepancies last week, 50 kilos were missing. I thought it was a clerical error. There are no clerical errors in this business, Detective. Vincent leaned back in his chair. Hayes stole the product. He's selling it back to the cartel, or he's using the police force to eliminate Reyes's competition. Me. Sarah slowly pushed herself up. The pain was immediate and blinding. She grit her teeth, a sharp hiss escaping her lips. She gripped the edge of the metal table, her knuckles white, refusing to lie back down. She needed to look him in the eye. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked, panting softly. "I'm a cop. You're a criminal. You traffic weapons. You run illegal gambling. You extort half the businesses on the South Side. You think a few photos of my corrupt boss are going to make me forget who you are?" Vincent didn't blink. He watched her struggle, his face impassive. He didn't offer to help her sit up. He respected her enough to let her fight her own battle with gravity. "I don't care what you remember," Vincent said coldly. "I care about my business. Hayes is using a badge to run a syndicate. He's tearing up my operations, looking for a corpse that I currently have sitting in my basement. If I kill him, the entire state police force comes down on my head. A mob boss killing a police captain is bad for business. So you want me to do it?" Sarah let out a bitter, breathless laugh. "You want me to take him down legally. I want you to do your job, Jenkins." Vincent's eyes darkened, leaning in closer. "I kept you breathing. I spent money, time, and resources to pull you out of the gutter. I expect a return on my investment. You want the rot out of your precinct. I want the police off my docks. Our goals align." Sarah stared at the mob boss. He was ruthless, calculating, and entirely devoid of morality as she understood it. He was everything she had sworn to destroy when she put on the badge. But as she looked down at the two deformed bullets resting in the plastic bag on the metal tray beside her, she realized the badge didn't mean anything anymore. The law hadn't protected her in that alley. The law had pulled the trigger. Vincent Rossi, the man who ordered hits and ran the criminal underworld, was currently the most honest man in her life. He didn't pretend to be righteous. He just dealt in facts and survival. "I have no access," Sarah said slowly, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "My passwords will be flagged. My apartment is definitely compromised. I have a burner phone stashed at a gym locker downtown, but I can't walk, let alone get past Hayes's men." "Leo will get the phone," Vincent said, shutting his briefcase with a loud snap. "You tell me what files you need, what proof you have to pull to bury Hayes and Gallagher. I will get you the access." "If we do this," Sarah warned, locking her icy blue eyes with his dark ones, "I am not going to turn a blind eye to your operations when it's over, Rossi. I'll burn Hayes to the ground, but I'll come for you next." Vincent stood up. A faint ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a smile of amusement. It was the smile of a predator recognizing another predator. "I expect nothing less, Detective. But first, you have to survive the week." He picked up his briefcase and walked towards the heavy steel door. "Get some sleep. The war starts tomorrow." The smell of old sweat and rust hung thick in the air of the South Side Boxing Club. It was 3 a.m., and the gym was deserted, save for the rhythmic squeak of a ceiling fan swinging lazily on its axis. Leo pushed the glass door open. The bell above it had been muffled with a strip of duct tape long ago, a courtesy for the insomniacs who came to beat the heavy bags in the dead of night. He walked past the ring, his heavy boots silent on the rubber matting. He wasn't here to train. He made his way to the locker room in the back. Rows of dented grey metal lined the narrow space. Sarah Jenkins had said, "Locker 402. Second row, far corner." Leo found it. A cheap combination padlock held the latch shut. 311422. He spun the dial. The lock popped with a metallic click. Inside sat a pair of worn running shoes, a damp towel, and tucked inside the left shoe, a prepaid burner phone wrapped in a plastic sandwich bag. He grabbed the phone. "Drop it." The voice came from the shadows near the showers. Leo didn't freeze. He didn't drop the phone. He slowly turned his head. A man stepped into the dim, flickering fluorescent light, holding a suppressed automatic weapon leveled at Leo's chest. He wore a heavy tactical vest over a plain black shirt. A cop. One of Hayes's ghosts, sent to watch the only place Jenkins might have left a lifeline. "You're out of your jurisdiction, pal," Leo said, his voice a low, gravelly hum. "Hands where I can see them, Rossi garbage," the cop spat. "Where is she? The captain knows she didn't walk out of that alley alone." Leo smiled. It was a terrifying expression on a man built like a concrete pillar. "You think I'm going to talk to a guy shaking so hard he can barely hold his peace?" The cop's eyes narrowed. He shifted his weight to fire. Leo moved faster than a man his size had any right to. He threw the heavy padlock straight at the cop's face. The metal struck the bridge of the man's nose with a sickening crunch. The gun discharged wildly, the suppressed shot burying itself in the ceiling tiles. Before the cop could recover, Leo closed the distance. He grabbed the barrel of the weapon, wrenching it upward, and drove his knee into the man's groin. The cop folded. A swift, brutal strike to the base of the skull sent him crashing face first into the damp tiles. Leo stood over the unconscious body, breathing heavily. He picked up the burner phone, wiped a smear of blood off his knuckle, and walked out into the freezing rain. Back at the clinic, the silence was suffocating. Sarah sat on the edge of the examination table. Her legs dangled, bare feet hovering inches from the cold linoleum. Her hospital gown was tied loosely over layers of thick gauze. She gripped the steel edge of the table, her knuckles white. She was going to stand up. She had to. Lying here meant Hayes was winning. Lying here meant Gallagher was walking the streets with a gold shield on his chest and a murderer's conscience. She pushed off the table. Pain, absolute and white-hot, ripped through her abdominal wall. Her breath vanished. Her legs buckled instantly, the floor rushing up to meet her. She didn't hit the ground. Two firm, unyielding hands caught her by the shoulders. Vincent held her up, his grip tight enough to bruise. He didn't say a word as he hauled her back onto the edge of the table. He released her, taking a step back, his face a mask of cold observation. "You tore a stitch," Vincent noted calmly, pointing to a fresh, dime-sized bloom of crimson soaking through the right side of her bandages. Sarah pressed her hand over the spot, her chest heaving as she fought to draw air back into her lungs. "I have to move. If I stay immobile, the muscles will seize." "You lost 3 pints of blood, Detective. Willpower doesn't manufacture red blood cells." Vincent pulled up his steel chair and sat. He placed a cardboard takeout cup on the table beside her. Heat radiated from it. "Drink it. Bone broth. Holden says you need the sodium." Sarah eyed the cup suspiciously, then looked at Vincent. "You're taking awfully good care of a cop you plan to use as a battering ram." "A battering ram is useless if it shatters on the first swing." The heavy steel door at the end of the room groaned open. Leo walked in. His leather jacket was soaked, and a fresh cut leaked blood above his left eyebrow. He didn't acknowledge the injury. He walked straight to Vincent and dropped the plastic-wrapped phone into his hand. "Had company," Leo grunted. "One of Hayes's off-the-books guys, watching the locker room." "Is he dead?" Vincent asked. "No. Concussed. Out cold in the showers." Vincent nodded, tossing the phone onto Sarah's lap. "Turn it on," Let's see what cost me a clean alleyway and 50 grand. Sarah's fingers trembled slightly as she peeled the plastic back. She held the small black device. It took 20 seconds to boot up. The screen glowed, throwing harsh blue light across her pale face. She punched in a 12-digit passcode. I backed up the impound ledgers to a secure cloud drive before the raid, Sarah said, her voice dropping into a professional, detached cadence. It was a defense mechanism against the pain. But the digital files aren't enough for a conviction. Hayes is smart. He doctors the digital logs to match the physical requisition forms. To prove he's stealing the heroin, I need the original handwritten doc manifests, the ones signed by the Port Authority. Where are they? Vincent asked, leaning forward. He doesn't keep them at the precinct. Too risky. Sarah swiped through the phone, pulling up a series of encrypted text messages she had intercepted a month prior. She turned the screen toward Vincent. He keeps a safe house, a secondary location where he brokers the deals with the Reyes cartel. It's an abandoned fish packing plant out on Pier 39. Vincent read the texts. His jaw tightened. Pier 39 was 3 miles from his primary shipping hub. Hayes was operating right under his nose. "Leo," Vincent said, standing up. "Call the boys. We're going to the harbour." Sarah slid off the table. The pain hit her again, but this time she anticipated it. She locked her knees, swaying slightly, but she stayed upright. She looked Vincent dead in the eye. "I'm going with you." "Absolutely not," Dr. Holden sputtered, stepping out from the sterilization alcove. He pointed a trembling, gloved finger at Sarah. "She's held together by catgut and stubbornness. She gets into a firefight, her blood pressure spikes, and those internal sutures will pop like cheap balloon strings. She'll bleed out in minutes." Vincent didn't look at the doctor. He kept his eyes on Sarah. She was pale, trembling slightly, and heavily sweating, but her jaw was set like granite. "I know what the safe looks like," Sarah said, ignoring Holden entirely. "I know the combination to the secondary lockbox. Hayes uses standard police-issue Mosler safes. They have a fail-safe trigger inside the door. If you blow it, incendiary charges incinerate the paper inside. You need me." Vincent calculated the risk in silence. He didn't care if she died, not fundamentally. But he cared about the ledgers. If his crew blew the safe and burned the evidence, this entire endeavor was a waste of blood and money. "Get her clothes," Vincent ordered Leo. "Something dark." Holden threw his hands up in defeat, retreating to his corner. 10 minutes later, Sarah stood in front of a cracked mirror in the clinic's tiny bathroom. She wore a black tactical sweater borrowed from one of Vincent's men. It was 2 sizes too big, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Beneath it, her torso was wrapped tight in fresh, heavy pressure bandages. She had swallowed 4 high-grade painkillers Holden handed her, washing them down with a sip of rusty tap water. The drugs dulled the searing heat in her stomach to a heavy, localized throb. It was manageable. Barely. She walked out into the main room. Vincent was waiting. He handed her a black holster attached to a thick canvas belt. Inside sat a Glock 19. "Chamber is loaded," Vincent said. "Don't shoot my men." Sarah strapped the belt around her waist, wincing as the thick material pressed against her wounds. She drew the weapon, checking the slide and the weight. It felt familiar, grounding. She holstered it with a sharp click. "Don't give me a reason to." The drive to the harbour was a masterclass in tension. 5 black SUVs rolled through the rain-slicked streets of the city, moving in perfect formation. Sarah sat in the back of the lead vehicle with Vincent and Leo. The wipers beat frantically against the windshield. The city lights blurred into streaks of yellow and red. "The packing plant has 3 entrances," Vincent said, looking at a crude blueprint on a tablet. Main bay doors, a side-loading dock, and a rooftop fire escape. Hayes will have men on all three. We hit the front hard, draw their fire. You and I go through the side dock. If Gallagher is there, he's mine, Sarah said quietly, staring out the window at the dark water of the bay approaching in the distance. Vincent glanced at her. Revenge is a sloppy motivator, detective. Keep your head clear. It's not revenge, it's justice. Down here in the mud, they look exactly the same, Vincent replied smoothly. The SUVs cut their headlights 2 blocks from Pier 39. The abandoned fish-packing plant loomed in the darkness, a massive, rotting structure of corrugated steel and broken glass, smelling of salt, dead fish, and diesel fuel. Vincent's men moved with terrifying efficiency. There was no shouting, no hesitation. They fanned out into the shadows. Seconds later, the sharp, suppressed thwip of gunfire echoed over the sound of the rain. 2 guards, standing by the main bay doors, dropped silently to the wet concrete. "Go," Vincent commanded. Sarah slipped out of the SUV. The cold air hit her like a physical blow, cutting straight through the oversized sweater. She gritted her teeth, keeping her center of gravity low, and followed Vincent toward the side loading dock. The metal door was rusted shut. Vincent didn't bother with lockpicks. He pulled a heavy pry bar from his coat, wedged it into the gap, and leaned his weight on it. The metal shrieked in protest before the deadbolt snapped. They slipped inside. The interior of the plant was a cavernous maze of rusted conveyor belts, empty freezing vats and hanging chains. Dim yellow work lights hung from the ceiling, casting long, shifting shadows. Gunfire erupted from the front of the building. The loud, unsuppressed roar of shotguns and automatic rifles. Vincent's distraction had begun. "Office is on the 2nd floor," Sarah whispered, pointing to a catwalk above them. They moved up the metal stairs. Every step sent a jolt of agony through Sarah's abdomen. She gripped the railing, her breathing turning ragged, but she didn't slow down. They reached the top landing. A frosted glass door marked manager stood slightly ajar. Light spilled out from the crack. Vincent pressed his back against the wall, leveling his weapon. He nodded at Sarah. She kicked the door open and pivoted into the room, her Glock raised. The office was a mess of overturned filing cabinets and scattered paperwork. In the center of the room, kneeling in front of a massive steel Mosler safe, was Detective Paul Gallagher. He was stuffing stacks of ledgers and banded $100 bills into a heavy duffel bag. He spun around, reaching for his shoulder holster. "Don't!" Sarah barked, her voice cutting through the room like a whip. Both hands gripped her pistol, perfectly steady despite the agonizing pain radiating from her core. Gallagher froze. His eyes went wide, the color draining from his rough, bruised face. He looked at Sarah, then at Vincent stepping out from the shadows beside her. "Jenkins," Gallagher breathed, his hand hovering inches from his gun. "You're a ghost." "Not yet," Sarah said, stepping fully into the light. She kept the sights of her gun leveled squarely on the center of his forehead. "Step away from the safe, Paul, before I do what you didn't have the stomach to finish." The rain hammered relentlessly against the corrugated steel roof, a deafening drumbeat that almost drowned out the muffled pop of gunfire echoing from the warehouse floor below. In the manager's office, however, the air was entirely still. It felt thick, heavy with the metallic tang of fear. Gallagher's hands remained suspended in the air. The harsh fluorescent light cast deep shadows over his face, highlighting the deep lines of exhaustion and panic around his eyes. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against the collar of his damp shirt. He looked from the barrel of Sarah's Glock to the calm, dead-eyed stare of Vincent Rossi. "Sarah," Gallagher started, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched scrape. Listen to me. You don't understand the play here. You don't know what Hayes is doing. I know he ordered you to put 2 hollow points in my chest, Sarah replied. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, devoid of the rage Gallagher likely expected. And I know you followed the order. Turn around. Hands on the safe. Gallagher didn't move. He kept his eyes locked on her face. He told me you were dirty, Sarah. He showed me bank statements, offshore accounts in your name. He said you were working for the Reyes cartel. I thought I was protecting the department. You're a terrible liar, Paul, Sarah said, stepping forward. The movement sent a fresh spike of fire through her abdomen, but she refused to let her hand shake. You didn't shoot me to protect the department. You shot me because you're on the payroll, and I was looking at the ledger you're currently stuffing into that bag. Now turn around. He sold me out, Sarah. Gallagher's facade cracked. His voice pitched into a desperate shout. Hayes took the lion's share of the heroin money and left me here to burn the evidence. He knew Rossi's men were coming. He set me up to take the fall. If you shoot me, you're just doing his dirty work for him. Vincent, who had been leaning casually against the doorframe, finally spoke. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that commanded the room. The detective isn't here to do anyone's dirty work. She's here for the doc manifests. Hand over the bag, Gallagher, and maybe she lets you walk out of here. I make no such promises. Gallagher looked at the mob boss, true terror finally breaking through his desperation. He knew Rossi's reputation. He knew a badge wouldn't stop the man from burying him in the foundation of a new high-rise. You think he's going to let you live? Gallagher sneered at Sarah, his fear twisting into cornered aggression. You're a cop. The moment you hand him those ledgers, he's going to put a bullet in your head and dump you in the bay. You're already dead, Sarah. Bag. Now, Sarah ordered, her finger tightening slightly on the trigger. Gallagher slowly lowered his left hand, grabbing the thick canvas strap of the duffel bag. He lifted it, his eyes darting between Sarah and Vincent. He extended the bag toward her. As Sarah reached out with her left hand to take it, Gallagher's right hand dropped in a blur. He wasn't reaching for his shoulder holster. He was reaching for the snub-nosed revolver strapped to his ankle. He never cleared the leather. Sarah squeezed the trigger. The Glock barked, a deafening crack in the confined space. The heavy 9mm round caught Gallagher in the right shoulder. The impact spun him around, slamming him hard against the heavy steel door of the Mosler safe. He collapsed to the linoleum floor, screaming, his hand clutching his shattered collarbone. Blood immediately began pooling on the cheap, checkered tiles. Sarah stood over him. The recoil of the gun had sent a shockwave through her core. Her knees buckled for a fraction of a second, a sharp, involuntary gasp escaping her lips. Vincent was there instantly. He didn't check on Gallagher. He stepped in front of Sarah, taking the heavy duffel bag from her trembling hand and slinging it over his shoulder. His dark eyes scanned her face, noting the sheen of cold sweat on her forehead and the shallow, rapid rise and fall of her chest. "I'm fine," Sarah breathed out, forcing herself to stand straight. "You're bleeding again," Vincent noted flatly. He glanced down at the writhing detective on the floor. "And you missed his center mass. That was sloppy." "I hit exactly what I was aiming at," Sarah shot back, her icy blue eyes flashing with defiance. "I don't execute unarmed men, Rossi, even the ones who deserve it." Vincent stared at her for a long second. A flicker of something entirely unfamiliar crossed his face. A quiet, profound respect. In his world, mercy was a fatal flaw, but in her, it looked suspiciously like strength. A sudden, deafening chatter of automatic weapons tore through the floorboards beneath them. The distraction at the front doors had failed, or it had served its purpose too well. Vincent pulled his own weapon, a sleek, customized 1911. Hayes's backup just arrived. Or the cartel. Let's go before they realize the party is up here. Sarah looked down at Gallagher. He was pressing his left hand over his bleeding shoulder, staring up at her with wide, terrified eyes. "Leave him," she said to Vincent. "Let Hayes explain to the feds why his missing detective shot his bagman in an illegal safe house." Vincent nodded. He grabbed Sarah's elbow, his grip surprisingly gentle but entirely firm, and guided her out of the office. They hit the metal catwalk just as the heavy bay doors below them were kicked open. 3 men in tactical gear spilled onto the main floor, sweeping the aisles with mounted flashlights. They weren't street thugs. They moved with military precision. Hayes had sent his personal ghosts to clean house. "Move," Vincent whispered, pulling Sarah toward the dark stairwell leading to the roof. The easy part was over. Now they had to survive the descent. The stairwell was pitch black, smelling of damp concrete and rust. Vincent moved first, his body a solid shield between Sarah and whatever waited below. The gunfire in the main warehouse had escalated into a chaotic symphony of violence. Leo and the rest of the crew were holding their own, but the numbers were rapidly turning against them. "We need the roof access," Vincent muttered, kicking open a fire door on the 3rd-floor landing. They spilled out onto another catwalk, this one narrower, suspended directly over massive, empty, freezing vats. The rain battered the skylights above them, occasionally illuminated by flashes of lightning. "They're on the stairs," a voice shouted from the warehouse floor. A second later, the catwalk rang with the sharp ping of bullets striking the metal grating. Sparks showered into the air. "Get down!" Vincent shoved Sarah hard against the railing. He didn't wait for her to recover. He leaned over the banister, firing 3 measured shots into the darkness below. A heavy thud, followed by a sharp cry, told him he had connected. Sarah crouched low, pressing her back against the freezing metal wall. The pain in her stomach was no longer a localized fire. It was a sprawling, suffocating agony that made it difficult to draw breath. She looked down at her sweater. The dark fabric was slick and heavy. The stitches had given way completely. "I can't run," she gasped, her voice barely audible over the din of the firefight. Vincent dropped his empty magazine, slamming a fresh one home with a sharp click. He looked at her. He saw the blood. He saw the grey pallor of her skin. He didn't offer empty reassurances. He simply holstered his weapon, slung the heavy duffel bag across his chest, and crouched beside her. "Put your arm around my neck," he ordered. "Rossi, I'll slow you down. Just take the bag." "I don't leave my people behind, Detective," Vincent snarled, his voice cutting through the panic clouding her mind. "My people." The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded. She wasn't a cop to him right now. She was an ally, an investment, something he was fiercely determined to protect. Sarah wrapped her arm around his thick neck. Vincent slid his arm around her waist, careful to avoid the worst of the blood, and hauled her to her feet. She cried out, burying her face in his shoulder as a fresh wave of agony washed over her. 30 yards, Vincent said, half carrying, half dragging her down the catwalk. "Keep your feet moving, just 30 yards. They moved as a single, staggering unit. Bullets tore through the air around them, shattering the glass of the skylights and raining jagged shards onto their shoulders. Vincent didn't flinch. He absorbed the brunt of the debris, keeping Sarah tucked tight against his side. They reached the end of the catwalk. A heavy steel door led to the roof. Vincent kicked it open, and the freezing rain hit them instantly, washing the sweat and cordite from their faces. "Leo! Roof!" Vincent barked into a small radio clipped to his collar. "On the way, boss. Northeast corner," Leo's voice crackled back through the earpiece. They crossed the tar paper roof, The wind was howling, biting through Sarah's soaked clothes. Her vision was tunneling, the edges of the world turning dark and blurry. She could feel Vincent's heart pounding against her side, steady and powerful. It was the only thing anchoring her to consciousness. An SUV tore around the corner of the building, its tires screaming against the wet asphalt of the alley below. It skidded to a halt beneath the fire escape. "Down the ladder, now," Vincent said, pulling her towards the rusted iron structure. Going down was worse than walking. Every step jarred her torn abdomen. Halfway down, her grip failed. Her foot slipped on the slick iron rung. She fell. She braced for the crushing impact of the pavement, but it never came. Leo caught her, grunting as her weight hit his massive chest. He lowered her gently into the back seat of the idling SUV. Vincent dropped down a second later, tossing the duffel bag into the front and sliding in beside her. "Drive!" Vincent roared. Leo slammed his foot on the gas. The heavy vehicle surged forward, tearing out of the alley and leaving the chaotic shootout behind them. The interior of the SUV was silent, except for the frantic gasps of Sarah's breathing. She was shaking violently, her body going into shock from the blood loss and the freezing rain. Vincent turned to her. He unbuttoned his heavy wool overcoat and wrapped it around her trembling shoulders. The coat smelled of expensive cologne, smoke, and gunpowder. "Holden is going to kill me," Sarah whispered, a weak, cynical smile touching her pale lips. Vincent didn't smile back. He reached out, pressing his large, warm hand firmly over the soaked bandages on her stomach. He applied pressure, his eyes locked onto hers in the dim light of the passing street lamps. "Holden works for me," Vincent said softly, his voice losing its harsh edge. "You just focus on breathing, Sarah." It was the first time he had used her first name. It wasn't a taunt. It wasn't an interrogation tactic. It was an acknowledgement. She looked at him, really looked at him. He was a ruthless criminal, a man who built an empire on violence and extortion. Yet, as his hand held her together, keeping her blood inside her body for the second time in a week, she realized the terrifying truth. The badge she had worshipped for 10 years had tried to put her in the ground. The monster she had sworn to destroy was the only one keeping her alive. She closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the leather seat, and let the darkness take her, trusting, against all her instincts, that Vincent Rossi would still be there when she woke up. Dr. Thomas Holden didn't yell this time. He was too exhausted. When Leo kicked the heavy steel door open and Vincent carried Sarah in, leaving a stark red trail on the grey linoleum floor, Holden simply grabbed his surgical kit. He looked at Vincent's pale face, his jaw locked tight with terrifying intensity, and understood. If she died tonight, the surgeon would join her. "Out!" Holden commanded, snapping latex gloves over his trembling fingers. Vincent set Sarah gently on the cold metal examination table and stepped back. He walked to the adjoining office, stripping off his ruined, blood-soaked suit jacket and dropping it onto a chair. He didn't wash his hands. Instead, he reached into the heavy canvas duffel bag they had pulled from the safe and took out a stack of leather-bound ledgers. For 3 hours, the only sounds were the frantic, uneven beeping of the heart monitor and the quiet rustle of thick paper. Vincent read every single page. Captain Thomas Hayes was not merely taking a skim off a drug bust. He was an architect of misery. The ledgers meticulously detailed millions of dollars in cartel heroin moved directly through the police impound lot using marked precinct cruisers. Hayes had turned the police force into a cartel, and he had used Sarah Jenkins as a sacrificial lamb to keep it buried. The door to the operating room creaked open. Holden stood in the frame, his surgical apron painted a dark, horrific crimson. He looked 10 years older, his eyes hollow. "She's stabilized," Holden rasped, leaning heavily against the door jamb. "I had to remove necrotic tissue where the stitches tore. She's pumped full of morphine and plasma. If she moves before Thursday, I'll tie her down myself. I am not putting her back together a third time, Vince." "Good work, Tommy," Vincent said quietly, his eyes never leaving the ledger. Holden looked at the sprawling paperwork. "You going to use those to bury Hayes, or are you going to blackmail him for the port?" Vincent didn't answer immediately. Blackmail was profitable, certainly, but Hayes was a rabid dog with a badge. Rabid dogs couldn't be leashed. They had to be put down before they bit you. It took 4 full days for Sarah to finally open her eyes. When she did, the blinding pain in her gut had dulled to a deep, heavy ache. The clinic was entirely quiet. A portable television sat on a metal cart at the foot of her bed, muted. She blinked repeatedly, her vision slowly pulling the flickering screen into sharp focus. The breaking news ticker was impossible to misinterpret. Captain Thomas Hayes indicted on federal racketeering charges. FBI raids, 12th Precinct. Sarah stared at the screen, her breath hitching. The footage showed Hayes, stripped of his uniform and wearing a cheap suit, being shoved roughly into a federal SUV. He looked utterly terrified. The camera cut to an aerial shot of the city docks, swarming with federal agents in dark windbreakers. "They didn't find the heroine," a smooth, calm voice said from the shadows. Sarah turned her head. Vincent sat in his usual steel folding chair, a cup of black coffee resting on his knee. He wore a pristine charcoal suit, looking exactly like the untouchable kingpin he was. "I mailed the ledgers to the FBI field office in Chicago," Vincent explained, taking a measured sip. "Bypassed local authorities entirely. The feds moved in at dawn yesterday. Hayes tried to make a deal, but the ledgers gave them everything they needed for 3 consecutive lifetimes. And Gallagher." Sarah's voice was a dry croak. "Found bleeding out in the fish plant by federal agents," Vincent smirked. "He's heavily guarded at County General. Rolled on Hayes the second they offered protective custody." Sarah let her head fall back against the sterile pillow. She had won. The rot was cut out of her precinct. But as she looked at Vincent Rossi, sitting comfortably in a clinic built on dirty money, the victory tasted distinctly like ash. "You kept the heroin," she stated. It wasn't a question. Vincent met her icy blue gaze. "I tipped the feds to the money and the men. I kept the product. It was a heavy tax for my unique services, detective. I'm a businessman, not a saint." Sarah closed her eyes. 10 days ago, she would have arrested him. Now she just felt incredibly tired. She had permanently crossed a line. She had shot a fellow cop, bled on a mob boss's coat, and survived solely because of the criminal underworld she had sworn to destroy. "They'll come looking for me," Sarah said quietly. "Internal affairs. They'll want to know exactly where I was." "Leo wiped the security cameras on 4th Street, Vincent said, standing up. He placed a burner cell phone on the metal tray beside her hand. "You were abducted by the cartel, escaped, found an off-the-grid place to heal, and contacted the FBI. The feds will believe it because it makes them look like heroes." Sarah looked at the phone, then up at Vincent. "Why are you letting me walk away, Rossi? I know exactly what you did." Vincent leaned down, resting his large hands on the edge of her metal table. She could feel the heat radiating from him, smelling tobacco and expensive cologne. "Because you owe me, Sarah," Vincent said, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "And in my world, a brilliant cop who owes you a life is worth infinitely more than a dead one." He stood up, adjusting his sharp cuffs with practiced precision. "Heel up, detective. The city is about to need a new captain. The door clicked shut with a heavy finality, leaving Sarah alone in the quiet hum of the clinic. She was alive, she was victorious, and she was entirely, permanently compromised. The line between justice and crime isn't a wall, it's a tightrope, and Sarah Jenkins just learned how to walk it. Her fragile alliance with Vincent Rossi saved her life, but the cost of her survival will alter the city's criminal landscape forever. The precinct is clean, but the streets belong to a new kind of partnership. If you loved this gritty, emotional journey of betrayal and survival, please hit that like button. Share this story with fellow fans of dark mafia dramas and subscribe for more. Ring the notification bell so you never miss our next thrilling audio series.